This three-part series reconstructs a central but underexplored problem in modern philosophy: the emergence of cognitive opacity as a structural feature of rational systems. Beginning with Kant's diagnosis of the automation of reason, the first segment introduces opacity not as mere error, but as the condition in which cognition produces correct outcomes without transparent access to the rules that organize them. This establishes a fundamental tension between success and understanding, between correlation and justification. Drawing on Kant's analysis of the dialectic of pure reason, the series argues that reason operates without full access to its own conditioning. It can extend indefinitely, generate new structures, and refine its operations, yet never attain completeness. As a result, self-transparency is never given in a single immediate representation. Reason can only mediate itself, and this mediation is the closest it comes to securing the appearance of understanding at the level of conceptual articulation. This unfinished character is not an accident, but reflects the basic architecture of human intelligence, a layered, sedimented system mediated by pre-reflective structures that never fully become conscious. Within this framework, philosophy emerges not as a technical solution, but as the highest reflective instance in which these implicit formations, ideology, myth, narrative, and conceptual inheritance, become partially visible. Philosophy, once the place where rationality was supposed to see itself in the form of concept, now functions as a site in which reason mirrors itself and temporarily stabilizes meaning by establishing a horizon, a phenomenological ceiling for introspection. Through this process, inquiry is able to close, crystallizing into scientific paradigms, culturally hegemonic frameworks, and technical feedback loops such as market rationality and instrumental calculation. This is how societies come to recognize themselves, by inhabiting the opacity of the very systems they produce, systems that gradually acquire autonomous operational momentum. Contemporary artificial intelligence represents the latest stage in this historical sequence. The second segment develops this tension through the notion of epistemic closure and its asymmetry with undecidability. The final segment advances an original reinterpretation of the Transcendental deduction, proposing apperception as an internal propagation structure that maintains coherence between experiential input and conceptual organization. This framework clarifies why cognitive systems can track success conditions while failing to track the reasons that make those successes meaningful. The series concludes by situating this problem within contemporary debates on artificial intelligence, underdetermination, and semantic alignment, positioning Kant not as a historical artifact, but as a theoretical origin point for current epistemic crises.
If modern philosophy has a disease, Kant is ground zero. Not because he invented the illness, but because he caught it early when it was still visible, before it became theater, before suffering turned performative, before confusion learned to speak fluently. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant names the infection with surgical precision: synthetic a priori judgments. Knowledge that expands the world, yet claims necessity, meaning that is not learned from experience, yet structures experience itself. Why is this the epicenter of modern philosophy? Because here the real question appears in compressed form. How do we give representational transparency to the rules that guide our reasoning? How do we distinguish genuine corroboration from mere accidental convergence? How do we know whether our proofs track reality or merely echo patterns that happen to work? Kant realized that without representing the unity of the rule that guides our judgment, cognition becomes blind execution, a sequence of steps without visibility into the form that organized them. This is what opacity means. It is knowledge without transparency, reaching correct conclusions while remaining ignorant of the structure that made them possible. You can follow a path to P and still be unable to distinguish it from other convergent paths that would have led elsewhere under slightly different conditions. Success becomes indistinguishable from accident. This is how Hume saw knowledge, operating on accumulated patterns without access to their organizing principles. It does not understand what it knows. It merely reproduces trajectories that once worked. Truth becomes indistinguishable from lucky alignment. That was Kant's nightmare. Not error, but automation of reason. Reason reduced to the mechanics of association. We would calculate without knowing which categories structured the calculation. We would reason without knowing which forms shaped the reasoning. We would produce results without possessing the conditions of their intelligibility. And in that fog, every proof becomes suspicious. Every success could be coincidence. Every method could be secretly guided by a genius malignus, not a demon of lies, but a demon of hidden structure, a system that always gives answers while never revealing the rules that justify them. Kant did not solve this problem. He exposed it. And once exposed, philosophy never stopped bleeding from this wound.
What we now call epistemology often mixes two different questions. What counts as a successful mental state, and what the mind ought to grasp? We measure success, coherence, prediction, alignment, and assume that this already tells us what the mind is for. And so, when we ask, what is this mind doing? We take ourselves to have already answered whether it knows. What the mind does, if it does successfully, is assumed to settle what it knows, or the content of its representation. Plato separates these questions. A mind can function well and still fail to grasp what truly is. Plato's distinction begins here. What the mind does is not the same as what it grasps. A belief may arise through perfectly workable processes, association, perception, inference, and still fail to reach what it is about. In his terms, Plato describes this condition as a mixture of being and non-being. This can sound obscure, but the point is simpler. When the same belief can be reached through incompatible routes, through trajectories that do not converge on a single structure, the process that produces it is not epistemically decisive. In Book 5 of Republic, Plato distinguishes belief from knowledge. Belief moves among many possibilities. It navigates a field where different configurations can still work. But knowledge, in its ideal form, isolates the model that does not compete with alternatives. Plato's insight goes further. This is not merely an inference by approximation, but a contentful act, the grasping of a unified representation that does not compete with incompatible alternatives. This problem reappears at the very moment epistemology becomes entangled with psychology. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant argues against Locke that knowledge cannot be reduced to the accumulation of impressions. Our access to objects must be structured through and through, not assembled from fragments. And against Hume, he insists, what is known must be representable as a unity, not a mere multiplicity, but a higher-order synthesis that binds it together. Husserl radicalizes this demand. The unity of what is known must be accessible independently of the psychological roots that lead to it. The structure of experience must be graspable as such. We are still in a Platonic territory, though transformed. My claim is this: they are right, but not in the way a Platonist would hope. Self-reflection is revealing, not because it grants access to a higher realm that grounds knowledge, but because it sets the ceiling and, for a moment, restores the ladder. The ladder is what allows a culture to see its beliefs, theories, and creations as things it can account for, as something it can trace, justify, and call its own.
We began with Kant's fear that reason might operate successfully without possessing transparent access to the conditions of its own success. We then placed that fear within a longer philosophical history, from Plato's distinction between belief and knowledge, to the Kantian and phenomenological demand that what is known must possess an accessible unity. The next part of the course moves from the mind to science. The question now becomes concrete. When a scientific framework succeeds, what exactly has been achieved? Has the mind merely found a pattern that fits the observations, or has it reorganized experience in a way that allows those observations to become evidence for a law. The complete course that you can find on Gumroad or my Patreon follows this movement from cognition to scientific objectivity, and then from scientific objectivity back to the architecture of judgment itself.
We're often told that science works by induction. You gather observations, extend them, and arrive at general conclusions. But if that were the whole story, Johannes Kepler would never have found the orbit of Mars. Because the data was already there. Tycho Brahe had produced measurements of extraordinary precision, and yet every inductive extension of the dominant model failed. The errors persisted, resisted correction, accumulated in ways that couldn't be absorbed. So Kepler doesn't just infer a better curve from the same data. He changes the space of possibilities. He moves away from the circle, not because induction pointed clearly to the ellipse, but because the circle could no longer sustain a stable, law-like structure. The shift is not from one hypothesis to another, but from one way of organizing what counts as a law to another. This echoes David Hume's worry. Induction alone cannot justify why one projection should hold. A Kantian response reframes the issue. Immanuel Kant would say that Kepler's conclusion is not merely drawn from experience, but conditioned by the forms through which experience becomes intelligible in the first place. Kepler is not selecting from raw data, but from a structured space of representations, one that determines what can count as a coherent, law-like description of the world. And this is why his framework prevails, not because it is simply more probable, but because it is more stable under variation, more continuous across cases, more capable of absorbing error without collapsing into ad hoc fixes. But this doesn't make it infallible. What it shows is something more subtle. Science, at any given moment, represents the best available organization of our conceptual resources. It stands as a kind of sovereign ceiling, not because it cannot be challenged, but because no competing framework at that time can seriously rival its ability to sustain law-like structure, absorb variation, and coordinate prediction.
There is a feeling most people have when they follow a valid deductive argument. The conclusion arrives with a sense of inevitability, as if it could not have been otherwise, as if the premises were always already pulling toward it. That feeling is real, but what it is striking is not what most people think. The standard story says, deduction is secure because it is formal. The conclusion is contained in the premises. Nothing is added. The necessity travels for the inference, like current through a wire. And this standard story has produced a very particular image of logic, one that has dominated the tradition and that most working logicians still implicitly carry. It is the image of logic as exceptional, logic as the domain where the mind operates without the contamination of empirical contingency. But notice what that story assumes. It assumes the wire was already there. It assumes someone already built the circuit, fixed the meanings, established the connectives, packed the content into the concepts before the inference began. Kant saw this with unusual clarity. For him, inference is not primarily an object to be studied from outside, a formal structure to be catalogued and admired. It is an inner process of judgment. Logic, on this view, is the study in the sense of explanation and not mere description of how a conclusion lands. And the way you study that is not by standing outside the mind and expecting its products. It is by interrogating from within what framework was sustainable enough to carry an inference, what conditions had to be in place for a content to be judgeable at all. Because not everything presents itself as a candidate for judgment. Not every content can enter the inferential space. Something must already be in place, a code, a framework, a set of conditions. Those determine what can connect with what. The framework is conservative in a very precise sense. It does not generate representations freely. It strains toward closure, toward the kind of harmony that formal inference enjoys naturally. Because only what can in principle close, only what can in principle carry inferential weight, only that can enter the space of judgment at all. A content is judgeable in principle only if it gravitates toward closure. And this is why for Kant, empirical reasoning carries a priori standards just as much as formal reasoning does. Both deduction and induction strain toward harmony, but induction cannot achieve harmony by stipulation. It cannot close the circuit by fixing the meaning of its connectives in advance, because its connectives reach outward toward a world that was not designed to fit them. So induction needs something deduction does not. It needs imagination, not free imagination, not the wandering of an unconstrained mind through logical space, but the conservative imagination that Kant describes as a priori schemas.
The schema is described as a mediator between pure concepts and sensory intuition, as if it were simply a translation device connecting two otherwise separate worlds. But of course, that translation is the link one needs to an explanatory framework that makes sense of the alignment between concept and intuition. We schematize a way to make that intelligible. The schema acts less like a dictionary and more like a constraint on possible explanations for the alignment itself. It filters the explanations that make sense, the frameworks that can carry the richness of the connections. And this starts to resemble a problem that would later reappear in cognitive science. Fodor repeatedly argued that learning cannot proceed through unconstrained accumulation of information. A mind facing an infinite field of possible hypotheses would possess no reason to converge toward one organization rather than another. Something must already structure the search. Some architecture must already restrict what counts as a candidate for confirmation. Otherwise, learning dissolves into combinatorial chaos.
And that is why human learning is explainable. Not because we have a complete theory, not because the circuit ever fully closes, but because patterns gravitate conservatively. The theories built must accommodate the difference between sense and nonsense. between the frameworks that can sustain thought and carry inference forward and those that cannot.
A representation that can be learned, stabilized, transmitted, and reused cannot be a purely accidental event. It must inhabit a framework capable of sustaining it, and that means explainability is no longer merely a practical demand imposed afterward by philosophers, scientists, or engineers. It becomes a normative condition of cognition itself, not because every thought requires an explicit explanation, but because every learnable representation presupposes access to a structure capable of supporting its inferential life. A thought that could connect nowhere, recover nothing, justify nothing, and sustain no future judgment would not merely be mysterious. Now this begins to feel slightly strange, because for Kant, explainability does not merely reveal technical features of cognition. It does not simply give us access to a collection of accidental standards that humans happened to inherit. It reveals something deeper, a constitutive image of rationality itself, an account of what a stable mind must look like if judgments are to possess objective validity. So the argument circles back toward normativity, toward a unified picture of what a successful mind is supposed to look like. Not merely a mind capable of producing outputs, but a mind capable of sustaining coherent inferential life. Rorty would later criticize precisely this ambition. He called it the picture of the mind as a mirror, the idea that cognition possesses a privileged structure whose task is to reflect reality correctly. And in a certain sense, Kant remains committed to something close to this. And this leaves us with a question that becomes increasingly difficult once we move toward modern cognitive science. Can learning, intelligence, and explanation survive without such a strong picture of rational organization underneath them? Can cognition emerge from statistical adaptation alone? Deduction initially loses its exceptional status because Kant treats it as one instance of a broader problem. How do representations become explainable and capable of entering judgment? Then, paradoxically, explainability itself begins to become exceptional, because once we ask what sustains explainable cognition, we drift towards selecting stable forms of thought and excluding unstable ones. Normativity returns. The pressure remains there, pushing toward a framework capable of restoring coherence, recovering connections, and stabilizing meaning. And perhaps this is why rationality repeatedly drifts back toward normativity. Not because minds love rules, but because unstable representations keep demanding resolution.
The Kepler case showed that scientific progress cannot be reduced to the passive extension of observations. A framework must determine which continuities matter, which variations are tolerable, and which errors reveal that the space of possibilities itself must be reorganized. The lecture on deduction and schematism then pushed the problem deeper. Even before a hypothesis can be tested, its contents must be capable of entering an inferential space. They must connect with other representations, support consequences, conflict with alternatives, and remain available for correction. The next part asks whether increasingly sophisticated cognitive architecture is enough. Could a brain or machine preserve all these relations and still fail to possess knowledge? This is where Kant's problem becomes a contemporary problem about cognitive science and artificial intelligence. Unlock the full 3-hour course exclusively on Gumroad and Patreon, where I distill the essential findings from 15 years of research on these themes, including my 2 landmark 2025 articles published in Revista Estudios Kantianos and Tópicos.
This is where my work on Kant, the subject of my PhD, comes back to a question that feels increasingly urgent. Cognitive science has become remarkably sophisticated. It offers rich accounts of memory, attention, and internal cognitive life. It can identify the level of complexity a psychological hypothesis needs if it is to explain mental life that do more than merely mediate stimulus and responses, like we do with a dog. A system, a brain, or a machine can process information, connect representations, generate predictions, and produce convincing explanations. Yet, none of that alone tells us whether its outputs track truth, whether its inferences are justified, or whether it occupies a genuine epistemic stance. We can use a psychological baseline of assumptions, a normal version of what a rational being would do, to explain why a person believes something, their history, habits, memories, associations, and available evidence. But explaining why a belief makes psychological sense is not the same as showing that it is correct. The baseline that makes a mind understandable is not automatically a neutral standard for truth, even if it tracks what most people would believe in a given historical era. Kant saw this problem in his response to Hume. Hume gave a proto-computational picture of the mind. Ideas become connected through habit, association, and repetition. Kant accepted that these processes occur, but argued that they cannot explain knowledge. Kant's question was, therefore, what must be in place for a sequence of mental events to count as a judgment about an objective world? Psychology largely moved away from that question, but it has returned with AI. If a system can generate language, arguments, and predictions, how do we distinguish information processing from knowledge? How do we tell when a system merely produces an answer and when it can justify one? Kant does not give us an easy answer, but he gives us the problem we still need to solve. How can a physical and computational system become a standpoint from which truth, error, evidence are possible?
In the first part, I argued that information processing is not yet knowledge. A brain, a machine, or an AI system can receive information, transform representations, generate predictions, and produce convincing answers. But none of that alone tells us whether its outputs track truth, whether its inferences are justified, or whether it occupies a genuine epistemic standpoint. Now I want to make the problem harder. Imagine two computational systems that give the same answer. Both say that a disease is caused by a virus, but the first reaches that answer through a broad statistical association. Viruses and disease have repeatedly appeared together. The second preserves a much richer structure. It distinguishes correlation from causation. It can compare rival accounts of what happened, assess which false histories remain more plausible than others, and track how conflicting evidence propagates through different routes, sometimes converging on the same conclusion, sometimes canceling one another out, depending on the dependencies between them. From the outside, both systems may say the same thing, but they do not compute at the same grain. This is why computational architecture matters. Two systems can have the same input-output profile while differing radically in their internal organization. One may reproduce a familiar pattern. The other may track second-order patterns, relations of similarity, distance, and dependence between patterns, including which alternatives are closer, which departures matter, and which apparent continuities conceal a real break. So perhaps the question is simple. Find the grain at which a system becomes sufficiently structured to represent the world. Someone would say Newton was closer than Aristotle, Einstein closer than Newton. But this is where someone can resist. They can say, fine, give the system a very fine-grained architecture. Let it track evidence, preserve distinctions, detect contradictions, model uncertainty, and revise its conclusions. It may represent the world, but none of that tells us that it has found the right representation. That objection is powerful. A system can be coherent and still be wrong. It can organize evidence around false assumptions. It can preserve distinctions that do not matter. It can be highly sensitive to its own data and still fail to reach truth. So perhaps computation can become increasingly granular without ever becoming a reliable epistemic device one could buy and then supply his tribe with in order for all of them represent the world correctly. It can represent, but never decide that it has the right representation. Kant did not think this was an easy problem, but his answer was not to add a little inner judge that watches every representation and certifies it. That would only create a regress. What certifies the certifier? Instead, Kant says that the question, is this representation correct, already places us within the standpoint of judgment. And that means that representation is never entirely free-floating. The moment a system represents at all, it already draws distinctions between this and that, before and after, object and appearance, regularity and accident. Once those distinctions are available, they make further distinctions possible. Kant's further claim is that we can identify the concepts doing the indispensable work in this space. Causality, for example, is not simply one more pattern we happen to notice. It is the concept through which a temporal sequence can be taken as an objectively ordered dependence, rather than as a private succession of impressions. In this sense, Kant thinks we are already in some genuine relation to the world. Our judgments are not arbitrary projections imposed on an otherwise inaccessible reality. But this does not mean that our current theories are guaranteed to be correct. Still, enormous error remains possible. 200 years from now, many of our settled theories may look radically incomplete, distorted, or false. This tension was not removed. Kant's claim is not that every scientific picture we build from these concepts must be true. It is that we cannot be wrong in every possible way at once.
What I want to leave you with is this. What has been offered here should be read as a blueprint of perhaps the most ambitious and arguably the best attempt ever made to find a necessary link between the workings of our cognition and the conditions of epistemic success. Between the production pipeline of our associations, our connections, our transitions from state to state, and whatever force it is that actually produces knowledge of the world. Kant is ground zero for anyone hoping to find, inside cognition, the lever or the categories that produces knowledge. This is why Kant is ground zero, not incidentally. Every cognitive scientist who scans a brain, looking for the circuit that does inference. Every AI researcher who probes a model's weights, looking for the mechanism that does reasoning, is chasing the same ghost. It is the same ghost Kant went looking, an inner lever, inspectable, whose presence or absence would settle the questions of whether cognition is really happening. But Kant never located that link in a neural zone. He paid for it in metaphysics, Transcendental idealism, because the necessary tie between mind and objective validity could not be secured any cheaper. The conditions of experience aren't facts discoverable inside the world. They are what make discoverable facts possible at all. That's why no brain scan will ever isolate the lever Newton pulled to reach gravitation. Not because our instruments are too crude, but because on the very picture that makes such a search intelligible, there is no fact of the matter sitting in nature waiting to be found. Success was never a further neural fact alongside the synapses. It was whether a judgment could stand answerable to truth. And no scan registers entitlement.